Good morning, everyone. Female Frodo Baggins here. Yes, I'm still doing that. Not everyone has gotten annoyed with it yet. Can you imagine if you guys, say, made a movie, and movies take years to be in pre-production, production, and post-production. Can you imagine if years ago you planned out so many movies and spent years working on them, only to then figure out maybe 6 months or even less before their release that, people don't actually want these movies, and then you had to desperately rework them and put them out into theaters like that because you didn't have anything else? How do you think that would go? Because that is what we've been experiencing this year, particularly with Disney, as they are the biggest movie company on the planet that makes all of this very influential stuff in the family space. But yeah, that is what they've been doing this year. And for this video, I just think that I should take the time to talk about where are we at with movies right now? Because right now we're in kind of a dry space going into just the few big movies we have for the rest of the year. We've kind of seen all of the big heavy hitters, except for Wicked for Good and Avatar, though. And they left themselves with nothing for the next couple of months. So I'm wondering, where are we now with movies? And what can we expect from the future, if anything good? Because things have definitely changed, and I want to go over all of that now and how this year is different than any other year, but that unless a certain thing changes, a certain thing that I'm going to talk about this in this video, things are not going to get any better. So how has movie-going and the kinds of movies that we're seeing coming out changed? Well, for years now, we had companies putting out movies that people did not want. I've been reminded of movies that have come out that I didn't even remember existed. Like, remember that Peter Pan and Wendy movie that wound up going on to streaming?
Are you
Lost Boys?
Every last one of us. But you're not all boys. So?
Stuff like that. Remember Solo, a Star Wars story? Remember when that came out and bombed? It's crazy. Look back at the years of movies and streaming content that we've gotten, and it's just insane for that time that we're living in. Shows like Velma, or shows like The Acolyte, or shows like Obi-Wan, Batwoman, live-action Mulan, just so many of these shows that were attempting to subvert expectations for what people would have for these characters and storylines, with the idea that they were going to capture a new audience, even if it meant leaving old audiences behind. That is the last 10 years that we've been living in. And despite year after year of being very vocal about how we didn't want this content, we didn't want characters that we like changed, we weren't into these kinds of movies, it seems that it just took years and years for Disney to finally figure it out. And Hollywood at large. I know not all those shows and movies I mentioned were Disney. And they finally figured out, it seems, at the end of 2024, when certain events may have happened to convince them. But anyway, there was definitely a shift that everyone is talking about where it seems that companies finally figured out, there isn't actually an audience for these movies and shows that we've been making. Hey, we've been looking at our stats with our box office and streaming numbers, and they haven't been doing well. But for some reason or another, it took until the end of 2024 for them to realize there isn't actually an audience for any of this stuff. But the problem is, after 10 years of denying listening to what the audience wanted, they had all this backlog of stuff. And that is what we've seen this year. So what were they going to do with all this stuff? They were going to have to desperately re-edit it so that it would not upset the audience that they realized was now the majority of the audience. So what movies did we have waiting in the wings in this year of experiencing the leftovers of a bygone age of Hollywood as they try to change all too little, all too late? Well, we had Captain America: Brave New World at the top of the year of February. For those who don't know the backstory of this movie, it was definitely going to be a lot more politically charged, like the show Falcon and Winter Soldier was in its approach. And they hired a director who, if you look at his IMDb page, pretty much had no experience with directing. So the result was, apparently they saw this movie at an internal screening at Marvel, decided it was so bad it could not be released, delayed it for months and and months on end, all the way until February of this year, and desperately tried to rework the film. And what was the result? Well, we got a terrible film where Sam Wilson really wasn't a character. It was a story about Harrison Ford, Red Hulk, trying to reconnect with his daughter. The CGI was absolutely terrible. The cinematography was probably the worst that I have ever seen in a recent mainstream movie, to the point where it gave me a headache because of how bad it was. And it was edited terribly, and yeah, it was a garbage film where the ending villain is fought with not a fight because Sam Wilson could not fight the Hulk, and he just talks him down at the end, and they all go home. Come see Avengers Doomsday. So yeah, there was no saving Captain America Brave New World, but hey, they edited out, I guess, all of the political stuff, so at least they didn't get some people upset with them with that, so, yay. But you didn't present us with a good movie. You presented us with a Frankenstein leftover of a movie that probably should not have been made in the first place, which we'll talk about in a second. What are some other movies that have been massively reworked that we know of this year? Well, obviously the Snow White movie. And I don't mean to go back. I don't want to go back to all of those Rachel Zegler interviews because it's been seen enough, but you know the drill. It was a movie that was definitely rejecting the old tropes of true love and the fairy tale elements of like love at first sight of the original version and really disparaging it. And it's taken so many years because there were just these loud voices that got into Disney's head for decades, actually, that told them that the old tropes that they would sell their movies on were bad and problematic, and that new audiences wanted this version. But the backlash to that movie was so loud that they seemed to finally figure out that's not actually what people wanted. So what did they do with Snow White? Well, they desperately tried to re-edit it. They re-edited in a romance. However, because that wasn't an element in the original film, and you can definitely tell, you just get this awkward song sequence that doesn't even sound like it belongs in the film, and a kiss scene that was one of the most awkward kiss scenes I have ever seen in any film. I have never felt that uncomfortable because you could just tell that the actors did not want to do it. But so that is another case of Snow White where it was similar to Captain America Brave New World, where the new modernized version of Snow White was flawed from its very premise. It is still embarrassing to see them have to work around why Snow White would want to bite into an apple, because this time they can't have it because of true love. All of the original blueprints of the original film were still in here. This movie was one that was flawed from the premise, that they shouldn't have been greenlit, and it was impossible to try to rework it last second into something audiences would like.
This is gonna be fun. All is fair when you wear the crown.
So it was another example of a Frankenstein movie. So what other examples do we have this year of Disney desperately trying to rework projects so that they won't offend audiences, I guess? Well, Elio was another one of these movies where the original version was supposed to explore queer identity, and they also gutted that film and severely reworked it after it failed at test screenings. Another movie I think I want to mention here is Fantastic Four. Now, this one has not been as publicized as the other three, but Fantastic Four is another movie that was made in the old era, where they thought that it would be a good idea to gender swap the Silver Surfer into female Silver Surfer, which I gotta say, Julia Garner probably had the most magnetism out of any actor on that movie, but I still think it was a bad idea to do that. But it's just elements like that. I'm not talking about how they might affect the final movie, but Fantastic Four was definitely a product of an older time with the decisions that they made with the film and who they cast. So it's another film that I do know for a fact went through a lot of major reworkings behind the scenes, and I wondered if some of that came down to the original movie was going to have definitely more of a feminist messaging with Sue Storm, and we know that a lot of her scenes with that were cut from the final film. So Fantastic Four, another movie that was severely reworked from its original version because its original version was made in a different time where they were still under the delusion that there was a certain audience that they needed to cater to. But as we see as Fantastic Four, bland movie as it turned out to be, it still did not do that well at the box office. It still was not a movie that they could rework all of a sudden to something that audiences would like. And then this is also the year of leftover shows that had to be very severely reworked. I know that season of Daredevil Born Again was severely reworked, and honestly, they still couldn't save it. Ironheart went through a lot of edits and they could not save that show. And that Disney has also been editing any sort of content that they think might step on people's toes when it comes to some something like Win or Lose. And I've been wondering how many other movies out there went through severe reworking that we don't know about. For example, if we're going to talk about the political area of this and how Disney might be re-editing films to get away from anything that might step on other people's beliefs, I did find it interesting in Freakier Friday, a movie I actually thought was pretty good for a modern film, nowhere near as good as the original. There was this weird thing at the beginning where they made it seem like Lindsay Lohan's teenage daughter was all into like trigger warnings and safe spaces and stuff, which is weird because I haven't heard that terminology since 2016, but it was kind of there in the beginning of the film, and there was this weird joke from Lindsay Lohan about how she tells the two girls, go braid each other's hair upstairs in a non-cultural appropriating way. And I thought it was just a really weird joke. Like, I couldn't tell if it was mocking people who talk like that or not. It seemed like it was this weird middle-of-the-road thing, like, take it however way you want. And then the rest of the movie wasn't like that. So I wondered, were there more jokes like that or elements of that in the original film that they took out? Because what I'm seeing this year, especially with Disney, but I guarantee it's probably happening with other companies as well, I wondered that about the How to Train Your Dragon remake, is that we're seeing a lot of remnants from the past, a past time where these movies would have gone for it in completely different ways, but then they got it into their heads that their audience didn't want that, and they had to severely rework them. Now, there are different opinions behind the scenes on whether this was right for the films, whether or not this made it worse. For example, with Elio, there are people who believe that that would have been a much better film if it went with its original intentions and wasn't gutted and reworked, and that it was the evil corporations at the head of everything that ruined these films. However, I disagree that these would have been good films or good shows if they hadn't been severely reworked. Why? Because I remember what was coming out in years past, like the movies and shows that I mentioned at the beginning. These were awful shows and movies. These were rancid. These were done, as we saw in the beginning, with the director for something like Brave New World who didn't have any experience. They've been hiring a lot of people at these companies who do not have a lot of experience to create these new shows for new audiences that have a lot of activism in them. And you can make things that are well made with activism in it, no matter what the message is, because good writers can make any story or message work. Good writers can make anything seem appealing to the audience. That's how writing works. A lot of times it's about emotional manipulation, but the problem is I do not believe that any of these projects would have been good at the forefront because they did not have people who were good working on them. I don't believe the original version of Brave New World would have been good. I don't believe the original versions of Snow White, Elio, or potentially Fantastic Four would have been much better. I mean, even with stuff like Elio, we know that behind the scenes, the start of its reworking came from a disastrous test screening where no one said that they would watch this in a theater. Internally, we know that Marvel knew that things like Daredevil Born Again and Ironheart were not suitable to be released. That's why Daredevil Born Again was severely reworked, and they tried to hide the release of Ironheart on their streaming service. But just imagine, like, this is just them doing a hard 180 on all of these projects made by these people all of a sudden, and it's not working. But imagine how many are left, like Mandalorian and Grogu, Hoppers. These have been in the works for all this time. It's a very slow ship to turn around, but like, how many more of these gutted film productions as they desperately are trying to turn around are we going to see? The big problem at the forefront of all of this is that they were planning these movies for an audience that didn't exist. Like, that's why they have to all of a sudden make this giant pivot all of a sudden to something else, because they all of a sudden got it through their thick skulls. Oh, there isn't actually a large audience for this. We have to all of a sudden change it, and that's why the results are all these Frankenstein films that don't actually work. But okay, so we finally at least got them to acknowledge that there weren't audiences for these kinds of movies and that these were bad ideas. So do we have hope for the future? Now we just have to live through however many years of these Frankenstein movies that they have in the works that they still have to release, and then we can get something good, right? Well, I hate to be a cynical one, but I want to be realistic as well. It's unlikely with how they're behaving now, pretty much. Let me explain. The problem with all these movies and shows were, like I said, the people working on them who do not have the talent. A lot of them just want to push certain messages that actually create good shows. And I gotta say, part of this is a bad mindset that we want to explore behind the scenes. For example, one of the last videos I did was talking about the article that talked about how Disney's Boy Trouble and how they are struggling with getting male audiences. They want male audiences back, and they're trying to get younger male audiences after they depleted their brands of Star Wars and Marvel. And you know, after that article came out, there was a guy who went kind of viral on Twitter, Matt Brawley, and he mocked the idea of Disney making movies and shows for young Gen Z males, which wouldn't be a big deal. It's just Twitter, but this was a guy who worked at Disney Animation for Disney Plus, who made one of their cartoon shows. So this is what I'm talking about here, is the mindset behind the scenes at Disney, behind their employees, that you would actually have people behind the scenes who would mock a portion of their audience, and the idea of catering to that portion of the audience. And that's been the entire problem with these movies and shows. They're not made by these great creatives. Like, you look in the past, like people like Chris Sanders, who still is doing stuff to the great stuff to this day. He did Lilo and Stitch, and he did The Wild Robot recently. Like, these people really had, I think, a good mindset. A lot of these mindsets that you see from older creators was that of a parent, and making movies and shows about parenting and their past experiences as adults. But then you look at people in the modern day, and they have this kind of mindset that wants to mock appealing to a part of the audience, even as Disney is saying they're having a problem with that. Well, you can't fix the problem at Disney if you still have people with this mindset. You can't have Disney appeal to young Gen Z males if they have people behind the scenes who think that that is laughable. And that's what I want to get at here at the point of this video, of seeing things good in the future. The problem with all of these movies that we're seeing today as these Frankenstein movies is that they were made in the past by people who were catering to an audience like them that didn't exist. They were catering to people just like them that didn't exist. And now they have to desperately pivot away from that. But the problem is that, have these people been removed from behind the scenes? Because what these companies would have to do now is to create new content for new audiences, understanding who the new audiences are and what they would want to see. But do they actually have the creative people behind the scenes to do that? If you still have people that you hired during this area trying to appeal to new audiences that didn't exist, then how can you possibly make things for the audiences that actually do exist if you still have the same people behind the scenes with these same mindsets? And that's the problem. It takes movies and shows a long time to get made. Like, let's say 2 to 3 years at least to develop it and go through all of the motions and all of that, which means that we are years out from getting anything good if we do. And that's an if, because what is Hollywood doing to change the people behind the scenes? Well, there's little things. They're bringing back people like Chris Sanders is going to work on Lilo and Stitch 2. Ron Clemmings is coming back to teach animators at Disney Animation after years of relying on the new people. He is going to try to bring it back to the original standards of animation. But these are creators that are aging. A lot of the great creators in Hollywood, they are aging out because they haven't spent any time fostering up new creatives under their leadership up to this point. They've been fostering up these young creatives to go their own way with this new content, and those people are all still in place. They have spent years not fostering up new talent that can actually make stuff that the actual modern audiences of today want to see. But the big problem that I'm hearing right now is they still aren't making an attempt to bring in new creators. What I'm hearing behind the scenes in Hollywood is, as opportunities become more and more scarce, they're just consolidating even more. They're gatekeeping even more and relying on the people that they already have in place. I think that that's how you get someone like James Gunn, who has a very specific taste in humor and the kind of comic book characters that he likes, working on Superman. But there are just so few creatives to choose from in Hollywood who actually know what they're doing anymore. Like, when people say, well, what director would you actually want for an X-Men film? I don't really have an answer, because there's not really a lot of people out there that I would trust to do it or be excited for, because they haven't spent any time fostering up new creatives. And that is the big problem that Hollywood faces right now. They need new people with new vision that are actually in touch and representative of what the audiences of today really want, but they're not seeking those people out, and they need to, because if they don't, then the few creators that they have left still in the industry that are coming back to try to teach people now, those people are going to age out. And I would say you still need people who are not in the mindset of someone like Matt, where they outright reject a portion of the audience and find that catering to them is laughable. If you want to cater to, say, young males, then you can't have someone behind the scenes working for you that thinks that that idea is laughable in the first place. That is my plea right now behind the scenes to companies, is that you need to find new people to work on these projects, because it is already going to take a long time for them to get made as it is. But if you hold on to these old people behind the scenes who were causing all of these problems in the first place, then that is never going to happen. The only way that you are ever going to win audiences back or find new audiences is to find new people who actually have talent and creativity who can cater to new audiences. If that doesn't happen, then there is no good horizon apart from all of these Frankenstein movies that you are pushing out now. You need to actually change from the inside, from right down to the people, from the production assistants and the directors and all of the people working on your movies that actually make them into what they are. Otherwise, you're going to just be left with a bunch of things that does not actually resonate with modern audiences today. What do you guys think of all this? Let me know in the comments below. Do you believe that Hollywood will ever change on this very important element? Let me know in the comments below. Please consider supporting me on Patreon or through memberships if you would like. I did finish my script. I've been talking about for years. It's just going through some revisions right now as I'm getting some as I'm getting some feedback on it. But thank you all for supporting me through that. I do intend to make my own films, and I will have more information on that very soon, and I will see you guys next time.